I was invited to address the first Congress of the Council of African Organizations in London. They had a 4-day Congress from the 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th, and had invited me there to make the closing address and bring the delegates from the various African organizations that are situated on the European continent up to date in regards to the struggle of the black man in this country in his quest for human rights and human dignity. And in conjunction with that invitation, I had gotten an invitation to visit Paris from the Afro-American community in Paris, which was sponsoring a rally in conjunction with the African community. And I was supposed to go there Tuesday also and address them and let them know the state of development or lack of development of our progress in this country for human rights or toward human rights. As many of you know, when I got to Paris, the man said I couldn't come in. Some man, French man. They gave me no explanation other than to say, we have our orders. They wouldn't let me phone the American embassy, and they tried to imply that the American embassy was behind it, which I told them that I didn't know de Gaulle had become a satellite of Lyndon B. Johnson. I knew that Kennedy had made a satellite out of Khrushchev and Britain and half of these other countries, but I didn't think that France was a satellite of the United States. Well, this made them angry because they like to be independent, you know, or pretend to be independent. The same thing happened in England. As many of you probably read in the Sunday Times and Tribune, there was a great fear in England concerning me speaking to the West Indian community. And this is because England has a very serious color problem developing because so many of our people are migrating there from the British West Indies. France, quietly as it is kept, has a very serious color problem developing because of the migration to France of our people from the French West Indies. And with these people from the French West Indies, black people going to France, others from the British West Indies going to England, coupled with the Asians who are coming from the Commonwealth territories, along with the Africans from French Equatorial West Africa, formerly into France, and the British possessions into Britain. There's a large, increasing number of dark-skinned people swelling the dark population of France and Britain, and it's giving them a great deal of cause for worry. The only difference over there and over here being that no one of black skin in France has ever tried to unite the dark-skinned people together, neither have they done so in England. So you can somewhat see what their fear is. No effort has been made to unite the Afro-American community or the American Negro community with the West Indian community, and then those two communities with the African community, and those communities with the Asian community. This has never been done.
Kennedy, I believe you call him a trickster?
He has to be a trickster. Even if he's the president, that doesn't stop him from being a trickster if he's making tricks. Anytime a man running for president tells Negroes what he's going to do for them when he gets in office, and after he gets in office, he has time to do something for everybody else except the people that put him in office, he tricked the people who put him in office. He has the time to take a stand against U.S. Steel, against Castro, against Khrushchev, against Laos and South Vietnam and all these other places all over the world. But when it comes to time to correcting the injustices that are being inflicted against Negroes in this country, Kennedy sits up there like Nero. He's fiddling while Birmingham is burning.
a new discovery which has not yet been published. It relates directly to the black communities across America. After here, I'm going to Bimini. As she said, I'm also going to be speaking at the Ouachita Conference again in Louisiana about this. But before I tell you about that, people will say, well, big deal, so what? Why is history important at all? History is extremely important. Imagine if I could take from each one of you as an individual everything you knew about life up to last week and just erase it. Where would you be? You'd be lost. You'd be incompetent. You wouldn't know how to plan for the future. And you do the same thing with a people. If you erase their history or you don't tell enough about their past, they also become incompetent and they can't fulfill the future. And that's why a lot of people in the black community have felt, well, how come all of the dreams of the civil rights movement aren't yet fulfilled? And one reason is because this history is still suppressed. It still isn't taught. But there's been a recent discovery which is going to blow the lid off of all that. And that's what I'm going to talk about. Now, basically, what science has now found, although this is suppressed for the most part, there have been some great researchers. You have some wonderful books here, like by Evan van Sertima, who's talking about these things. This is not taught in your public schools, although it will be. The history that the children are learning today is not going to be history that's going to be taught in the next 25 years. It's going to be radically different. We now know for a fact that long before Columbus, there were 4 major migrations of blacks to the Americas, different parts of the Americas, for totally different reasons, totally separated from each other by many centuries. But nonetheless, there were these black, you can call them migrations, but they were not entirely. I'll describe, and you can make up your own mind what they were. The most recent of these took place about 400 years before Columbus was even born, and it's all outlined in a marvelous book over there. It's called The Golden Trade of the Moors. And it is now known that the West African Kingdom of Mali had huge fleets of merchant vessels, and that these kings, these black kings of West Africa, began sailing across the Atlantic to Mexico as early as 900 AD. Now, why did they do that? They did that for trade, not for conquest or invasion. They did this for trade. Mali was very wealthy in gold. They had lots of minerals. Some of the black kingdoms, they were called the Yoruba or the Benin. They were great workers in bronze. But the trouble with West Africa, and it's still a trouble today, not enough food, famine. Somehow, the black kings of Mali had preserved this tradition of long before, where there was this kingdom across the sea, a totally different one. It was very hard to reach. You needed to have excellent ships and good sailors, and nobody in Europe was doing it at this time. But if you cross that sea, this other kingdom across the Atlantic was very rich in a certain kind of food, which the people over there called maize. We now call corn. And these West African kings launched at least 2 major fleets, trading ventures, that went across the Atlantic 900 AD to about 1600 AD. And they brought over their bronze work, and they taught the Mexican people, the ancient Mexican people, who were then known as the Mayas. The Mayas had built up a great kingdom of their own, but in 900 AD they were in decline. They were really on the outs. Nobody knows exactly why, but their society was in decline. They were losing all of their technology. Then these black fleets came across from West Africa, from Mali, and they presented a lot of gold work, bronze work, and in return, they came back with shiploads of corn, maize. Now, we know for sure that this actually happened because very recently, you'll see in the next issue of our magazine, not this issue, the next issue is coming out in about 2 weeks. This is part of the discoveries are happening so fast and furious, it's hard to keep track. They now have found that a certain type of maize or corn, which is growing in West Africa, has been growing there for many centuries, is not native to West Africa. It is a type of corn which comes from Mexico. Could have only been brought over by these Mali seafarers over 1,000 years ago. So this is a first concrete proof that they beat Columbus by centuries, and were not just on a voyage of exploration. They were going back and forth bringing corn back. Now, why don't we know about that? Well, this trade stopped abruptly 1600 AD. 1600 AD, the Spanish, the Portuguese run a real aggressive colonizing campaign, and they took over Africa, and they destroyed a lot of these kingdoms. And with the destruction of these kingdoms went all the knowledge and all the history of these past trades. This is a tremendous lesson for us because, you know, we're so proud of our American civilization. We think it'll go on forever. But when a civilization falls, history tells us it takes almost all memory of it with it. Civilization is really very fragile. And that's why these lessons from the past are very, very important. If we want to preserve our civilization, we have to learn what happened to these others that crashed. So we know for sure between 900 and 1600 AD, long before Columbus was even born, as I say, these blacks were trading, these black kingdoms were trading with Mexico. If I have to refer to my notes, it's because this is new to me as well. There's also traditions in Mexico, ancient Mexico, of these black kings coming. And one of them was called, by the Mayas, if I pronounce this right, Ekchua, which means the black calabash or the black gourd. It referred not only to his black skin color, but also this gourd that he brought over. This gourd has been portrayed in these Maya hieroglyphs. This guy is portrayed as a West African type of man with robes and everything. And he's holding a gourd in these glyphs. That gourd has actually been identified as a West African type of gourd. So here we're having wonderful proof that there were these contacts between Africa and Mexico. And they actually referred to him by this name. And it shows that the Mayas and these Mali civilizers, these Mali traders, got along really well. It wasn't a conquest. It wasn't one society taking over another. They both had things to offer each other. The Africans had to offer metallurgy and gold, and the Mayas had to offer corn. So there's a wonderful example of, for ourselves too, two totally radically different cultures, separated by a vast ocean, tremendous cultural and racial differences, and yet they still cooperated and got along real well. So. It can happen. But these Mali kings, 900 AD, they set out because they had a legend that there had been blacks going long before them. It was only a legend. It was only a myth. And it was on that myth that they chanced and they went across the sea and it worked out for them. But that myth traced all the way back to an even earlier black contact between Africa and America. And I'm talking about now not Mexico, but what we call now the United States. And this relates to this new fabulous discovery. that is coming out. About 200 years before Christ, up until right at about the time of Christ, in other words, about 2,000 years ago, there now appears that there were wealthy West African and North African blacks who left Africa on a pilgrimage and came, if you can believe this or not, but there's solid proof for it now, to southern Illinois. Now I'll explain how that happened. In 1982, our time, there was a guy who was going along southern Illinois. He was a cave hunter. And he was, I don't know if you're familiar with southern Illinois at all, on the Ohio River. It's just honeycombed with caves, thousands of caves. They have not all been explored by any means. And he was involved in sport for hunting in caves. It's done all the time. It's rough work. Sometimes these caves are very narrow. He went into, to make a long story short, he went into this cave that no one had ever seen before. And he squeezed through a very narrow entrance, and all of a sudden it turned out into an enormous room. And in this room, he found great sarcophagi, or coffins, coffin lids, made out of stone. The walls are engraved with all kinds of stories, picture stories of men and women in old costumes from the ancient world. And then on the floor, he found stacks of thousands upon thousands of these black rocks that were beautifully engraved with the profiles of people, not Indians, people from other parts of the world. Some of them were white, some of them were Asian, but hundreds are of black people, all in profile. They are made on a type of rock which is found really mostly only in southern Illinois in caves. This rock is like a clay. You pull it out of the ground and you have like a stylus or a pen, and you can draw on it real fast. You can draw profiles and letters, and then as it dries it turns into a hard rock. And these rocks are piled up on the floor of this cave. Now this man's name is Russell Burroughs. He's not an archaeologist, he's just a spelunker, he's a cave enthusiast. He brought these out over time. They're very difficult to bring out because the cave entrance is so narrow. And he's brought out now almost 10,000 of these magnificent tablets. They're very crude looking as rocks are concerned, but the drawings are beautiful. And they show the profiles of black people, some with scarification, which is West African, mostly with not that, some with specifically West African robes, which are still used today. Some will have a man on one side and a woman on the other. Some will be entirely women. It has each one of these 10,000 have a script associated with these pictures. Nobody's been able to translate the script. Well, since 1982, this place has really been contested a lot, but finally some professional archaeologists are involved, some top archaeologists, and they have verified that it is all authentic, and they have dated it now, and there's going to be a lot of information released in the next few weeks and months about this find. Who are these people portrayed in this cave? Not all black, but a lot of them are black. Some of them will show like a black man with a kind of a sailor's cap, and in the background will show like a ship or a fish. It seems as though they're portraying a captain or a sailor of some kind. It's now understood, it's very involved, complex. You'll see the whole story in our magazine in the next few issues. It appears as though around the time of Christ, just before the coming of Christ, in Rome, there were a great many mystery cults. And these mystery cults, they were called mystery because they were secret, not because it was a mystery. It was secret. And in order to get into this mystery cult, you had to go through different levels of initiation, like the Freemasons, you know, which are not unrelated to it, believe it or not. There were many mystery cults like this, the cult of Osiris, the cult of Isis, and a lot of other cults we don't know about. And then to get into these cults, we do know you had to pay money, you had to be fairly well off, and the final stage of all these mystery cults, you had to go on a long pilgrimage, a long quest. All that cost money, but you would go on this long quest to a sacred place. And at that final sacred place, you go through an initiation of some kind. And when you went through that initiation, you were finally a member of this mystery cult. And these mystery cults were all the same in that they promised the individual who went through this initiation eternal life. You didn't die. You survived after light. And these levels of initiation showed you how your soul made this progression. All that's been lost, although some of it has survived in Christianity, which is basically the same. That you don't die. If you are a good Christian, you go eternal life with Christ. And some of these ideas apparently were shared in common. Now these blacks apparently, they all look well fed. There are no starving people portrayed in this. And they all are with jewels and everything. So they're well-to-do people. That fits. What the archaeologists now think is that these wealthy people, no matter what their race was, but a lot of them were black, would participate in this mystery cult, would cross the sea and come to a cave. This specific cave in southern Illinois was the holy place. It was far away. It was hard to get to. It was extremely secret. It was part of the mystery cult, but they knew about it. Apparently the Romans knew about it. This is like a Roman cult that was open to anybody that could afford to go through it. And they went through their final initiation, whatever it was, in this cave. And when they were finished, they had their portraits drawn. It's just like you have your picture taken when you graduated, right? And then in the Catholic Church today, we still have things called votive candles and votive statues. Like you'll go to a church and you light a candle and you leave part of yourself there. Or you have like a statue of the Blessed Virgin or St. Joseph and you'll leave it there. Little inexpensive statue. The same idea seems to be working here. You would go through this mystery cult. You'd come all the way across the ocean on this great hard quest, all the way to southern Illinois to this strange cave. You'd go through these rituals, and when you completed them, they would draw your portrait real fast and put your name on there, and then they would store it in the sacred cave. You didn't take it with you. That's why it's done on kind of crude stone, although the drawings are not crude. The drawings are excellent. And these inscribed tablets were put in this cave because it was like the votive part of you. You left that part of you there. So when you went back to Rome or Africa or wherever it was, part of you was still in this cave. And it is no hoax. It was one time I thought maybe it was a hoax, but now they found over 10,000 of these. They're beautifully done. It's beyond anybody to hoax this stuff. So here's this earlier migration. And because it was part of a mystery cult, it was not well publicized. And so we can kind of excuse historians for saying, well, there were no Romans or blacks or anybody at that time going across the ocean, but there were. The reason they didn't know about it because it was part of this mystery cult. Something of that myth, though, must have survived all the way into Mali times, up into 900 AD, when those kings of Mali decided to cross the ocean. Those two black migrations to the Americas are not the only two. There are two more, two earlier ones still. We go way back in history. Around 1,000 years before Christ, 3,000 years ago. It's such a long time ago, it's hard to even imagine. There were a people called the Phoenicians. These were Canaanite people that are mentioned in the Bible. They were half Semitic and half something else. Who knows what they were? They were very well traveled. They were very great seafarers. And they employed all kinds of races on their ships because they didn't really have any particular homeland. They were always traveling, went everywhere. They were the first to go around Africa, known to go around Africa, 900 BC. And it's known that they employed many blacks on their ships, not as slaves. They had no slaves on board their ships. But they did have sailors. They did have captains. These people definitely crossed the ocean also to Mexico. It made a very strong impact on a civilization called the Olmecs. The Olmecs, that's just as a name for this very, very early civilization. The earliest known civilization in Mexico. And everyone thought at one time, well, it's just an Indian civilization until 1861. In 1861, a farmer was plowing his field, came across a very strange domed rock, a black rock. And he couldn't dig it out. The more he dug down, the bigger this rock got. Until he dug the entire thing away. It took him weeks to dig it away. And it turned out that he unearthed a 9-foot-high statue of a head, beautifully done, of an African, not an Indian at all the portrayed features of a West African man. From that time until recently now, there have been 11 of these giant stone heads. Let's see, I'll give you an idea how big they are. They're an average, well, there's 11 found now. They're between 6 and 9 feet high, and they weigh 40 tons apiece. They're magnificently carved. While these were being found, more of the Olmec civilization was found, and a temple was discovered that had also the same type of people, these West African people portrayed as kings and warriors. So when the first archaeologists found these, they says, well, these are probably just blacks that got blown across the sea and were enslaved. But you don't make huge heads portrayed with crowns of your slaves. You know, these were obviously regents, powerful people. How did they get there that long ago? Because those heads are dated to about 3,000 years ago. So far as is known, there was no black civilization then. That came later. It appears that these were sailors and captains working with the Phoenicians. Maybe they jumped ships, maybe they got shipwrecked, but somehow they got along fine with this Olmec community, so much so that they rose to become the leaders of that society. One of the other new things that have been found is that the heads, the black heads of these great Olmec kings, wear a strange kind of headgear. It comes down halfway by the ears and circles the entire crown of the head. There's nothing like that anyplace else, until they found, starting to find now, these old leather crowns that were studded with gold and brass that were used by the early kings of Mali. So only two places in the world do you see the same strange type of crown, amongst the Olmecs in Mexico and West Africa. So here again there's this parallel. Now, even older than this, I mean, they talk about, you know, our ancestors coming over on the Mayflower. This beats them by thousands of years. There has been another stupendous discovery. I mean, they're coming so thick and fast, probably because our technology is expanding, as you know. And as our technology expands, we're able to find out more faster. Over in Japan, and this relates to what we're talking about, was found an underwater city, the first ever found. It's right off the coast of southern Japan, by Okinawa, where the great battle was fought in World War II. And this underwater city extends for 311 miles on the bottom of the ocean floor. The deepest one is 100 feet, deepest building is 100 feet, the others are 20 and 40 feet. And they show streets and boulevards, they show pyramids. I've got photographs I'll show you tonight. These photographs have not well been publicized, but they will be. Great plazas, huge steps, all underwater. Now, this place is probably related to another old legend, and that is of the lost civilization of Mu. Mu was supposed to be a Pacific island civilization that sank long ago, but before it sank, And while it was sinking, it was not a fast or catastrophic end for the most part. While the oceans rose when the ice melted at the glaciers that covered all of this area, you know, at one time. 10,000 years ago, they began to melt very rapidly, and when they melted, they flowed into the oceans of the world, and they raised the ocean level by about 100 feet. So this civilization goes back maybe 10,000 years. Hard to believe, but the evidence seems to suggest that the city at the bottom of the sea goes back that far. The reason I mention that is because all of the traditions of Mu and all of the research that has been done into it in our show there were three races of people on Mu. There was a Caucasian people. I'm going to use these terms, by the way, scientifically, not sociologically. This is just to define a people. A Caucasoid people, a Negroid people, and a Mongoloid people. Excuse me, not a Mongoloid people. A brown people. I don't even know.
And over 800 different languages. And when you come to this country, you get to see into the culture. Now, every single tribe has their own customs, their own dances, and their own rituals. And this is what you experience. This is what you feel. We're asking the spirits permission for us to come into the village. I came to Papua New Guinea because it's one of the few places where it's still possible to experience Stone Age cultures. It's the country that boasts dramatic natural beauty, that's characterised by jungle-clad mountains and underwater reefs.
I guess there's several things. You know, the culture is so alive, and it's such an ancient culture. You know, dating back to the early migrations, tens of thousands of years ago, not a lot's changed. And you can come into first-person contact with people who remember what it was like before white men arrived. You know, you can go to a village in the Sea Peak, talk to an old man who can remember the first time he saw a white man. I mean, where else can you do that in the world? And then you've got second, third generation children who still rarely see outsiders because they live in such a remote place.
Nice to meet you. I'm Lynn.
Same to you.
Nice to meet you. Nice to... Oh, don't you look beautiful.
This is Lucy.
Oh, Lucy.
Hi, Lucy. We were taken into the village by Jimmy and Lucy. How amazing is it to be able to see behind the scenes into the culture of Papua New Guinea? I mean, there's so much expression in this land. The people tell their stories through dance, they tell their stories through music, and they celebrate all sorts of things through. This is a great way to be greeted by these remote villages.
And that was considered only legend, only myth, that these three races run there. They equally shared power politically. The reason why they did it was part of their solar religion. They believed that the sun has different phases of the year, and so they should share power. As the sun shares power with its light on the earth, so these three races had to share power equally. The reason why they believed that was they believed God manifested his power and his identity in natural law. What you see, the flowers growing, the sun, the stars. You can't see God, but you can see what God does. That's God's law. So if you live in harmony with God's laws, you see it in nature, doing God's will. That's what these people believed. And so by having the sun at different phases of the year, you share different power. Sometimes the white people, the Caucasoids would be the power. Sometimes the blacks would. Sometimes the brown would. That's their tradition. When this land sank, this high civilization brought some of its ideas to different parts of the world. The brown people became part of what is now Polynesia. And the Polynesian, I can tell you for a fact, the Polynesian legends are thick with stories about Mu. The Hawaiians have a people they call the Mu, who were there before they were. The white people apparently didn't do as well physically. They were more or less wiped out, or they dispersed and intermarried with people in China, it appears. But the blacks, however, went in two directions. And this is beyond legend now. Now we're moving into hard science. When Mu sank, or when Mu was in the process of being inundated by this great rising wave of water, they went in two directions. They went out to what is now known as Oceania and became a people known as the Negritos. And they also went towards Mexico and impacted this Olmec civilization. And the reason why we now know that is because there was a genetic trace done. You know about DNA now. That's getting a lot of play in the paper. DNA means you can trace the genetic code of a people. The genetic code of the, and there are still native blacks in Mexico. That's never been explained by archaeologists before Columbus arrived. DNA tests done on them. DNA tests done on the bones of some of the Olmec people, not all of them, the ancient remains, show a definite genetic trace, not to Africa only, but across the Pacific. When they found that out, they said, that's got to be wrong. It just doesn't, there are no black people out in the Pacific, but there's this definite trace, lineage they could trace out towards Hawaii and beyond Hawaii. Then they began a worldwide match of DNA. Well, do these strange black people, who do they match up with? They don't match up with Africans. They matched up with the Negritos in Oceania. It looks now, scientists believe, there was a central point from which they went in both directions. So this is a marvelous heritage. Some people say, well, you're a white guy, how can you talk about stuff like this? I get flack from this on both sides. The purpose of our magazine is to tell the truth about what happened to our country and our continents before Columbus. And if it shows that there were white Vikings here, and there were, we tell that. And if it shows that there were Asians here visiting, Chinese here visiting Mexico, we'll tell about that. And if there were blacks here, we have to tell that too. That's all part of our heritage. And I think it's thrilling and exciting for all of us. It's remarkable. So what we're telling you, I mean, this is just in a nutshell, and you're going to be seeing a lot more of this, not just in our magazine. Believe me, you're going to be seeing this on TV. It's bound to burst out because it's really known in the archaeological community. You've had 4 of these major impacts that the black people have made to the Americas, not only before Columbus was born, but before even Spain or Italy existed. That's the kind of roots that are in this country. And by knowing that, and the more you know about it, it's an empowerment. You're really rooted. You have got a heritage which is more than slavery. Sure, there was slavery, but that's not all. That's a small part of it. Long before that, there's a heritage of kings, seafarers, religious missionaries, and they were all here. But it happened so long ago, there's just so little of it left. And that's basically my story. What connects it up is even the word Moor, because it's pronounced differently in different parts of even of Africa. And they call themselves Moor, Mu, Mur. There's all variations of that, so that even the name Mur. I'll leave you with one thing which is really interesting too that relates to this. The Mali kingdom, part of their religion, around 900 AD, they believed in a god called Vodun. Vodun or Vodan. And they said Vodan was this great sailor who came across the sea, and he taught the Yoruba and the Benin tribes how to work with metals. And he was their man god, as it were. He was like their founding father, their George Washington, was Vodun. And he brought tablets. He said they brought tablets, which he taught people how to read. Vodan was his name. Vodan and Vodun. Across the ocean, all the way across the Atlantic Ocean, amongst what they call the Quiché Maya, or the lowland Maya that I talked about, they have a tradition of a god they called Vodan, same name, who brought tablets across the sea to tell them how to work metals and so on. So here we're dealing with the same tradition. This is something which is not made up or interpretive. It's the actual fact. It's the truth. So the more of these you have, like I say, the greater the sense of empowerment. So I'm going to stop here because I think these photographs are better than anything I can say. And if you have any questions, feel free to interrupt the action here. Yeah, I'm going to have to turn the slide off, I guess. Now, this is something I hadn't got time to go into because it's so long, but it's really interesting. This is a drawing from life that was made, believe it or not, by a so-called American Indian, the southern coast of California. He was a member of the Chumash, no longer exist. When the Spaniards met up with these people, they said, these are civilized Indians. They got along extremely well with them. The reason why they got wiped out, though, was because they had no immunity to the diseases that the Spaniards brought over. And so they were all wiped out. This is the last of them, about the mid of the early 19th century. They were a black people who built fantastic boats. They were like Viking boats, believe it or not. They were lab-straked, over one plank over the other, so they were very resilient in the water. They had a tradition that they did not originate in America. They came from this great island out across the Pacific. And they lived in a number of islands off of California. One of them was Santa Barbara. You've heard that, Santa Barbara. And they called Santa Barbara Limu. That was their name for it. So this man, probably the last of the Chumash, one of the last of the Chumash, represents one of these people from Mu, the very early times. These are representations from Ivan Van Sertima's book. You've got one of them here. It's excellent. These are one of the Olmec heads. This is one of the figurines that are found throughout Mexico. What's interesting is that these people are never portrayed as servile or slavish. They're always portrayed as prosperous, as bringing things, bringing metals. Oh, I forgot to mention, too, a grave was found in the Virgin Islands of a skeleton that was dated back to about, not too long ago, to maybe about 1200 AD. But still, centuries before Columbus came here, definitely had a black skull, Negroid skull, and he was buried with an iron tool. Well, according to what we've been told, the people in Virgin Islands had no iron, but the Mali were great iron workers.
According to the demographics of the original people in Cuba, they say about 68% of the Cuban people are black and mulatto, maybe more. I have discovered in my travels throughout the world that hiding the black reality is part of the white strategy of supremacy. The original people in Egypt, Syria, Cuba, Saudi Arabia, Argentina were all people of color. But when they send their representatives of the ruling party to America as ambassadors, they send white representatives of their people. They do this so that it hides the reality of the indigenous people of their land. I did not know that there were many black Syrians until I went to Syria. I did not know that there were so many black Palestinians until I went to Palestine, now called Israel, and my Hebrew Israelite brothers walked with me and we talked to Palestinians, and I asked them, how long have you and your people been here? He can't even tell you how long it's been that long. Well, the point is, our people are there in Cuba. They live there. So under America's blockade and sanction, my brothers and sisters, as well as other human beings,
I appeared
are
before
suffering.
Congress on July the 7th, 1987. I'd been summoned there to give due cause. They should not refer to Columbus's accidental stumble into the Caribbean, which he thought was the backside of India, as a discovery. I remember when I entered the chamber, this gentleman, head of the Quincentenary Commission, came up to me and said, "You don't mean to say you come here to say Columbus did not discover America?" I said, "Yes." He said, "You must be mad." I said, "You look mad to me too." As a result of my presentation, Congress decided to delete the word discovery from official documents. I presented a vast body of evidence, and it started as a peculiar accident because I was in the British Information, I was in Services, then I was in the British Information Services, and never intended to come to America. I'd heard such dark things about America, but I'd heard dark things about most countries. Anyway, I was on my way back. My Prime Minister had invited me to read poetry at the occasion of the independence of our country, independence celebrations, because I was known then as a poet. And I was on my way back, and Jan Carew, a famous Guyanese author, invited me to come to America, and I said, no, I'll never go to America. I've heard such dark things about America. No. He said, don't be foolish. There are dark things about all places in the world. You come and check it out. So I came there on a Saturday. Sunday morning he was asleep when I came down into his library, and I saw 3 green books, Africa and the Discovery of America, by Leo Wiener. This was done, I think, in the 1920s. The problem with Leo Wiener, however, he was strictly a linguist. And I felt that finding a number of African words in America would not be enough to prove the point. To prove something like that, which would overturn a great amount of thinking, would call for a vast body of evidence in many fields. So I actually began a critique of this. 30 years ago, I actually began to attack my own subject. I didn't know it would become my subject, because it wasn't good enough. Linguistics, I was trained as a linguist. I know that you could occasionally get a number of words. You'd have to prove a lot of things. You'd have to have evidence in many fields to prove something like this. So I sent it to the editor, and I said, if anyone could show me just a few sculptures or portraits of Africans in America before Columbus, I would take another hard look at this matter, because he presented no pictorial proof. And he knew nothing about skeletal material, so he couldn't provide skeletal proof. And the editor at Random House, Charles Harris, called me up and said, Van Sertima, something strange has happened on my table. You ended your piece by saying, if anyone could show me images of Africans in America before Columbus, I would take another hard look at this matter. And I turned the page, and I turned the page, and I turned the page. There were 7 images of Africans. John Williams, the novelist, author of The Man Who Cried I Am, had been to Mexico and met a strange German, last of the Royal House of Germany. Hitler had put him in charge of the German embassy in D.C. And something happened, and he was dismissed. I was later to find out why he was dismissed by Hitler, because Hitler sent around a circular saying that everyone in the diplomatic service has to sign a statement saying they're a pure Aryan. And von Wutenow wrote back. Now, he was a Count, the last of the royal house in Germany. This was strange for von Wutenow, strange for anybody in that position. Wrote back to say, there is no such thing as a pure Aryan. All people have black blood. Oh, God, he had to flee after that, because Hitler would have gotten him. So I rushed off to Mexico to meet this strange man. And I went to his chateau. He'd heard about me because I had written him first and told him what I had done. And we sat in that place, okay? We sat on his steps half the night arguing, because he couldn't. You have to show me a hell of a lot of evidence to convince me of something that everybody believes is true history. And he says, I said, I have to see these heads. He said, I have a few in my study. I said, that's not good enough. I have to be sure that they are valid, that you are now making this up. He was a little annoyed by that. He wanted to throw me out of the house. But nonetheless, I persisted. You have to prove this to me. I need to see sculptures of these people. And he says, they're not in the big museums. They don't take chances like that in the big museums. You have to go to private collections. And the next day he started to take me to private collections, and I was utterly stunned. You would be surprised how much history is hidden in private museums. They don't allow these things in the big places. It's just like in Egypt. I am responsible for returning to the modern Egyptians the splinters of the Sphinx's nose and chin which Napoleon's army blew off. A friend of mine, Garland Roberts, an adventurer, he was in England. He went into the British Museum, and he found that they had the splinters of the Sphinx's nose and chin. How he did that, but he's a fellow, he's a daredevil. He would risk his life just to prove a point. And I says, you go back there. I'm going to pay your way to Britain. You go back and photograph the damn thing. Pretend you are a, messenger boy, whatever it is, get a job there, get the damn thing. And he brought back startling pictures. And I called Sheikh Anta Diop, head of the radiocarbon laboratory in Dakar. He's dead now. He was the leading African scientist. And I got in touch with him, and I told him what had happened. And I got in touch with Gamal Abdel Mokhtar, the Arab delegate at UNESCO. Sheikh Anta was at UNESCO too. And I got in touch with, I told Garland Roberts, he has to be on the phone. And we started a conversation with the British Museum. And I started out by saying, sir, we understand and we have hard visual proof that you have the splinters of the Sphinx's nose and chin in your museum. And I have the Arab delegate at UNESCO here and the African delegate, etc. And we'd like to negotiate the return of the splinters of the Sphinx's nose and chin to the Egyptians. Now, okay. Now, Van Sertima, we can't do that. See, most of the things we have in our museums come from all over the world. If we started returning things to this and that country, we'll have no museums. I said, sir, we're not asking you to destroy the museum. This is a specific object. This is a matter of the very gravest importance. I have on the line with me Gamal Abdel Mokhtar, the Arab delegate, Sheikh Anta Diop, the African delegate, myself, Garland Roberts, who has proof that they were the pieces. It's me, he photographed them. And he said, well, we will consider it. Do you know? Sheikh Anta spoke. I had a French translator. Sheikh Anta spoke. I spoke. Alan Roberts spoke. Do you know the Arab delegate? We're returning it to the bloody Arabs, you know. He never said a bloody word. Because the Arabs are not Egyptian. Don't make any mistake about that. It's just like we're in this room here. This is America. It would be hard to find a Native American in this room. The world has changed dramatically. There have been half a dozen invasions of Egypt, the Persians, the Greeks, the Syrians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Arabs. That is not Egypt. Egypt is no longer Egyptian. They have not a damn thing to do with the building of the pyramids. We now have hard proof, very hard proof, that Egypt was African when the pyramids were built. There is no question about it. This is not guesswork. This is not theory. We found the skeletons in the ancient graves. We found sculptures, which you'll never see when you go to Egypt. They don't put those things on display. But now we have the hard proof. And I'll deal with that later when we come to deal with the Egyptian section of this lecture. But I appeared before the Congressional Committee and I presented 12 witnesses, all European. Because they're going to say I'm Afrocentric if I show them this African said this. No, no, no. I'm going to take the very people that you think you will listen to. Columbus is the first person. I said, that's how I began. I'm not the first person to suggest there were Africans in America before Columbus. Christopher Columbus is the first person to say that. He actually says in the Journal of the Second Voyage that when he was in Haiti, Native Americans came to them and told them that black-skinned people had come from the south and southeast trading in gold-tipped metal spears. Columbus may or may not have believed, but he actually collected samples of these spears. They were sent back to Spain. They were meticulously, microscopically examined in Spain. And they were found to be identical, not just similar, identical with spears being forged in African Guinea. Of 32 parts, 18 were of gold, 6 of silver, and 8 of copper. Not only were they identical metallurgically, the words the Africans were using for these spears were the words the Americans were using. African word for gold, Ghana. That's why it's called Ghana. Gold Empire, the Golden Empire. And I checked it out in several African languages. Sarakole, Soninke, Gadzago, it's Kane. Vayan Mende, Kani. Kisi, it's Kani. Kono, it's Kanin. Fuel, it's Kane. That's the word for gold. And that's the word the Americans are using. And they have their own bloody gold word. Why are they using this strange word? And presenting material which when checked out, when the metallurgists checked it out in Europe, they found the spears were identical in the ratio of gold, silver, and copper alloys. How could you have linguistic and metallurgical identities like that? It is utterly impossible. Not only that, I then went beyond that. I not just showed Columbus. Ferdinand wrote a book about his father, and he said, my father told me that he saw Negroes north of Honduras. Columbus knew what a so-called Negro looks like. He was in Africa. That's how my book began. Columbus sitting at a table in Africa, arguing with the Portuguese. I tracked this man down. It is possible when you become very famous, people could track every little thing. Who you slept with, who you tried to kill, who slept with your wife or your husband, everything. And one found a hell of a lot of stuff on this clown, or rather this villain. He did some horrible things. He's known as the Great Discoverer. Ferdinand said, my father told me he saw Negroes north of Honduras. He not only heard of them in Haiti, he actually saw them north of Honduras. Vasco Núñez de Balboa, on September the 25th in the year 1513, I've got it down to the day, He's coming down the slopes of Quaracu and Darien, which we now call Panama. And he and his men saw two tall black men among the Native Americans. They are startled. They haven't brought no black people there. Several of them commented it. Peter Martyr said they must have been shipwrecked. Then he also said they were Ethiopians. Well, Ethiopians, the word Ethiopian is not used for people of Ethiopia. The reason why Ethiopia gets that name, Ethiop means burnt skin. People of burnt skin would generally call them Ethiopian. So it's not referring to Ethiopia. Peter Martyr said they must have been shipwrecks. Lopez de Gamara said these blacks Balboa saw in the Indies were identical with the blacks we saw in Guinea. Rodrigo de Colmenares saw blacks. Captain of Balboa saw blacks east of the Gulf of San Miguel. Alphonse de Catafalque reported in his book, Study of Panama. L'Abbé Brasseur de Bourbourg was the guy who went to Panama, said there were two distinct people in Panama. The Mandinga, black skin, and the Tule, red skin. The red skin would be the Native American. And Alphonse de Catafalque presents us with a map showing blacks in various places in early America. The Charus of Brazil, the Yamasee of Florida, and the black Caribs of St. Vincent, pre-Columbian. Alonso Ponce cites them off Campeche in Mexico. River Palacio cites them off Tegucigalpa in the Nicaraguan-Honduran border. Ramon Pane speaks of them as the black gold traders. Fray Gregorio Garcia cites them off Cartagena, Colombia. A dozen Europeans, Christopher Columbus, Ferdinand Columbus, Vasco Núñez de Balboa, Peter Martyr, Lopez de Gamara, Rodrigo de Colmenares, Alphonse de Catafalque, L'Abbé Brasseur de Bourbourg, Alonso Ponce, River Palacio, Ramon Pane, Fray Gregorio Garcia, seeing things that are not there. Probably blacks are haunting their dreams. It's absurd. You cannot have 12 eyewitnesses to an event that never happened. And I have not just 12 eyewitnesses. That is just one piece of evidence. I have 12 pieces. So it's not just the eyewitnesses, there's the metallurgical evidence. That it was tested. They were found to be identical in the ratio of gold, silver, and copper alloys as spares being forged in African Guinea. 18 parts gold, 6 silver, 8 copper. How could you have identities like that? Then there's the linguistic identities, which I just mentioned. Saracolis and Inki, Gadzago, Vai, Mende, Kisikono, Pule went through half a dozen African languages to check out the word. And they're using the same bloody word that the Americans are using. How is that possible? If it was a European, you only need one piece of evidence. I'm giving you 7. How could you deny that? And it doesn't stop there. There is the botanical evidence. Take the banana. We use the word banana for the banana, but that's not the African word for the banana. The word for the banana is bakoko in Africa. Banana is an Arab word. The Africans didn't have bananas. The bananas were introduced into Africa by the Arabs very early, and they have a different word for it. Banana. They do not have banana. They have bakoko. I have checked the bakoko word because they found bananas in Peru. Peru didn't have bananas. Pre-Columbian Peru is not supposed to have, they didn't have original bananas. The banana, the reason why we found the banana is because when they buried their dead, they would have ceremonies every year, the year of the day of the dead, and they would put fruit in the grave, and among the fruit they put in the grave was the banana. And they do not originally have bananas. That has been checked out. It's only found in these graves. If they were eating the banana, we'd find other kind of evidence. And the word for the banana in Peru is the same as the word for the Africans have. We call it banana, but the Africans call it bakoko. So I started checking out the words in Peru. How did this banana appear? They don't have bananas at that time in South America. And found in Galibi it's bakuku, in Oyapock it's bako, in Oyampi it's these are all South American languages. In Oyampi it's bako me, and Tupi is bako ba because and are interchangeable plosives. And in Apiacus it's bako wa, In Puri, it's Baho. So you have Bako Ko, Bako Ku, Bako, Bako Me, Bako Ba, Bako Ba, Baho. Can't happen unless you have a connection, a very early connection. And then comes the oceanographic evidence, because most people say, here is Africa and here is America. How could the Africans cross? They only have canoes that Tarzan can turn over in the movies. But that's another myth again. First of all, there are two things here that they did not take into account. I lived on a river. My father was superintendent of road and river transport over an area that was as large as Scotland and Wales. I grew up in the river. I grew up in the river. And my mother and father were divorced. That was the first divorce in our country, recorded divorce in our country. They later remarried. That was the first recorded remarriage in our country. I wouldn't advise you to do it. It doesn't work. But anyway, they did it in order to save the children, and I am grateful to them, but they suffered. But anyway, to come back, you have this knowledge. I had this knowledge of currents because I used to swim 3.5 miles across the water to the air base. That was a big thing to show how you are. You know, boys are like that. They're always playing the ass, trying to prove they're strong. Several of us drowned. So you could see what I mean by playing the fool. Anyway, I used to swim across the river, so I was extremely strong. And I knew about currents, because most people think the river is just like that. No, the river is alive. In certain parts of the falls in Guyana, the water is running as fast as a motor car. You don't have to have an engine. You have to know how to steer. Or it hits you against the rock and you're blown to pieces. The water moves as fast as a motor car. And in those waters, they do not move as fast as a motor car, the great rivers, but they move with force and take you places. And we have discovered 3 currents of Africa that take you automatically to America. There's one up the Cape Verde, one up the Senegambia coast, one up the southern coast of Africa. Once you are caught in those currents, you have to come to America unless the fish get you first. Whether you have an engine or not, the water is the engine. It's very powerful. And it's exactly where those currents end that we find the African presence. It goes to Mexico. It goes into other parts of America. It goes to Brazil. They've recently found, listen to this, look at the lies involved here. They recently found an African Negro woman. I say Negro because not all blacks are Negro. The African has 6 faces. For example, if you're in a dry African climate, you have a narrow nose. If you're in a wet or moist African climate, you have a broad nose. Most people don't know that. They don't know they have 6 types of African. There's the Nilotic type. They're all black. But they have the Nilotic type, the so-called true Negro type, all sorts of types they have. And I have in my new book the faces of the various types. And all of these types appear. But what is most extraordinary is the evidence we have of their ships. They had the ships. Thor Heyerdahl became world famous because he got the Baduma people on Lake Chad to build a boat that the Africans built before Christ. Thor Heyerdahl used the boat the Africans built before Christ. They showed him the model. They built the boat. He financed it. A boat they were using before Christ, and it crossed the Atlantic successfully. Heyerdahl told me, Van Sertima, we did not even have to fish. The fish jumped on board. Because in those currents are millions of fish. Millions. And it wasn't just Heyerdahl. Alain Bombard also tested African boats. And they made it in less time than You have several, if you study the the work I have done in the new book, Early America Revisited, you see these guys made it in less time than the European boats because of their knowledge of the currents. And they're not only currents off the Cape Verde, off the Senegambia coast, off the southern coast of Africa that take you to America. They're currents that spin you back towards Africa. We have an evidence of a boat, American boat, Native Americans landing in Africa 62 BC. There were 7 in the boat because it was an accident. They were taken to because the currents that not only take you there and pull you back. We don't have any evidence of Europeans doing that. We have it in Native American 62 BC. That is in my book, They Came Before Columbus. And apart from this oceanographic evidence, there's the navigational evidence. That's the boats. The Africans had the boats. The Africans built the boat for Heyerdahl. Heyerdahl became world famous about how he crossed the Atlantic. He didn't build the boat. It was Africans who built the boat for him, a boat they had used before Christ, the Buduma people on Lake Chad. It's in my new book, Early America. You'll see the boat. The Africans built it. They could easily have crossed. And when you cross, the current actually takes you into the Caribbean, to Brazil, or parts of South America, to Mexico, etc. Recently, listen to this, look at the cheating going on, look at the profound dishonesty of scientists. They found a Negro woman in Brazil, where the currents come from Africa, the Caribbean, Brazil, etc. They found a Negro woman in Brazil, 12,500 years old. That is even before the Native Americans. Now, Negroes always came from Africa, but it was so embarrassing that they suggested, yes, it's a Negro, but it came from Asia. Now, this is Brazil, you know. Brazil is on the Atlantic coast. To come from Asia, you have to get a boat that's going to take you all the way to South America, and then you have no car. Currents may take you, help you to get to South America, but then you have to walk to Brazil. Then you get the tip, you have to walk all the way to Brazil to drop your skull. And the New York Times ran the story like that, you know, thinking, and they even changed the name. When they found this Negroid woman, they call her Louisa, because the first human we found on earth is Lucy in Africa. So they call her Louisa. But when it got to the New York Times, they call her Valherbe or Malherbe or something like that. And she comes from Asia. Niggers don't come from Africa anymore. They come from Asia. You find them in the wrong time, in the wrong place. Jesus Christ. I mean, how far can you take this nonsense? It is absurd. And you find also skeletal evidence. Listen to this, because I have to be very careful here. I was in 2 intelligence services in the world, the Guyana Intelligence Service and the British Intelligence Service, and you're not supposed to tell secrets. So I have to say this in a way that shows that I don't know nothing. Okay. They found 2 African skeletons in the United States Virgin Islands at Hull Bay, St. Thomas. These skeletons were found in a strata or layer of earth which is datable 1250 AD, 2.5 centuries before Columbus. But they could not date the bones. Something strange had entered the bones of these skeletons. Now, I know why something strange had happened, why something strange had entered, because of something that was done in that area, and I'm not allowed to talk about it. All I could say is not far from Cuba, and Cuba was giving us some trouble, and we had to tell Castro, come on, we're the world power, so don't play the fool with us. We'll teach you a lesson. That's all I'm allowed to say. But I went down to the Virgin Islands when I heard about these skeletons. And they promised, I shamed Vesalius, the archaeologist of the island. I spoke to the whole university, a big crowd, shamed him. He said he'd allow me to see the skeletons. Come there by 12 o'clock the next day. I arrived 10 to 12, raced across the island. Arrived at 10 to 12. The door was locked. Well, I am a very nice person, but when I get angry, I'm not very nice. So I ran at the door, wham! Shook the place. The police came on. What are you doing here, sir? I was invited here. You know the police, don't you see the place is closed? Yes, sir, but it's very strange that it should be closed. I was invited here. I was to come here by the... Move along, sir, or we have to arrest you. Well, I moved along. But fortunately for me, friends on the island who'd heard of my interest and I'd spoken to the university there, they took me to a rock pool at St. John. That was St. Thomas where they found the skeletons. They took me to a rock pool at St. John's in the Virgin Islands. And they wanted to show me carvings of tropical animals. When I saw these carvings, I said, no, that is not evidence. Those tropical animals are in both places, both Africa and America. But as I was preparing to leave, the light of the sun shone on the rock, just above the rock pool. And I looked down and I saw a strange formation, dots and crescents. And I said, nature cannot do that. Nature cannot do that. It's because it will wash against the rock and it may cause a kind of cleavage in the rock, but it can't make perfect curves and dots and curves. It cannot do that. So I went down there and I cleaned the rock and I photographed it. I sent it to various parts of the world. I sent it to Africa. So someone in Africa, in Ghana, said it's the Guinea sign, and I said, send me evidence of the Guinea sign, and he sent it to me, and I said, no, don't waste my time, man. That doesn't look anything like the Guinea sign. But I kept taking it wrong, and eventually Dr. Barry Fell of Harvard, he's dead now, he'd written America BC. The New York Times ran 3 pages attacking me and Fell. I brought out, they came before Columbus. Barry Fell brought out America BC. He was dealing with other kinds of contacts. I was dealing with African contact. The New York Times ran 3 pages attacking me and Fell. They wouldn't even allow anybody in America. But fortunately for me, Dr. Clarence Wine, the oldest of American archaeologists, who'd been on the place where they found the stone heads with African faces, he wrote a marvelous essay on me because he was the oldest American archaeologist. They couldn't kick out his essay. So he said, I am absolutely convinced of the soundness of Van Sertima's conclusions. So in spite of all that, it came through. But look now, the skeletons, we cannot move on. Because recently we have another clown who's entered the Virgin Islands, and he's saying now that even though they're in strata 1250 AD, these skeletons could not be, could not be Africans because they have, could not be proper Africans because they have something teeth. You know, they have some problem with the teeth. And Africans cannot have that problem because they are some sort of nonsense about they don't eat certain things, you know, so that they, I mean, the most absurd, I mean, I find it difficult to remember it because it is so absurd, I do not know how long I could keep it in my golden brain. I mean, these people are awesome. I mean, look, what incredible evidence. If I did not find that script which was translated, plunge in to cleanse yourself, this is water for ritual ablution before prayer, because Barry Fell says, it's Libyan, so I sent it to the Libyan Department of Antiquities, and they came up with the translation. Plunge in to cleanse yourself, this is water for ritual ablution before prayer. And then comes a map. It's in my new book, a map of Brazil that shows independent black settlements in Brazil, pre-Columbian. And then comes the oral evidence in Mali. They speak of a king, Abu Bakr II, who wanted to cross the ocean because he felt there was land beyond. And he appears, the Mexicans report this strange black man in white robes appearing. And it is also reported by the Arabs because Mansa Musa went to Cairo. He's a Muslim, and he went to Cairo. When he was in Cairo, he talked about, they asked him, what happened to your brother? And he told him that he wanted to cross the ocean and he never came back. And it's recorded by the Arabs in Al-Kashandi and the Masalik al-Absar fi Mamalik al-Amsar, so that's the documented evidence. Then there's the iconographic evidence. So I've presented 12 pieces of evidence: eyewitness accounts, metallurgical evidence, linguistic evidence, botanical evidence, oceanographic evidence, navigational evidence, skeletal evidence, epigraphic evidence, the script, cartographic evidence, a map, oral evidence of the Mali Griers, documented evidence, the Arabs, Al-Kakashani, the Masalik al-Absar, fi Mamalik al-Amsar, and the iconographic evidence. That is, you look at my book and you're going to see sculptures of Africans. There's everything. The texture of the hair, the shape of the faces, lips, noses, everything. And one of the things they found, and I'm not going to talk about it at this point in the lecture, later, they found something that is so astonishing that they are utterly embarrassed. And that was found after. But here is the 1310, 1311 journeys where I present 12 pieces of evidence. I did not know of an even earlier visit, because that is what I presented to Congress, and they decided to delete the word discovery. So let me make it quite clear. Truth, trust that the ground will rise again. Now we come to another part of this BC, something that happened before Christ. Now, Egyptians made a journey across the Atlantic. How did they do that? Why did they do that? How do we know that they did it? Listen carefully. Do not confuse modern Egypt with ancient Egypt. These are two totally different worlds. Here we are in America, and it would be very difficult to find an American in this room. We call ourselves Americans because we are in America. We are American citizens. But there are African people here, European people perhaps, Asian people, but no Americans. I am part American, I am part Makusi Indian and part African, but it would be difficult to find an American audience that is pure American. That's why Egypt, do you go to Egypt and you said the Arab is not an Egyptian? The people who built the pyramids were not Arabs. I know, man, because I am responsible for returning to the bloody Arabs the splinters of the Sphinx's nose and chin, and the Arabs do not want to remake it because it looks Negro. But we can go into the graves. We can go into the graves and we find the hard evidence. The skeletal evidence is overwhelming. But you see, Egypt was so rich. The Africans were so extraordinary. And they were not superior people. You don't have inferior and superior people. This is what makes you superior and inferior. A certain vision of the world. A certain vision of yourself. Many of us have been destroyed, reduced, because we've been made to accept other people's vision of us. You look at Hitler. Hitler was a bloody lunatic. We threw him in prison in his early 20s. Hitler was walking about the prison like this. Guards bowed to him. That was an awesome person, boy. I mean, he was evil, but he was awesome. Napoleon, too. Napoleon wasn't even a Frenchman. Most people don't know that. I am destined to glorify a people I hate. Could you imagine that as Napoleon? I read his diaries. I am destined to glorify a people I hate. And then the one thing I regret most in my life, this is Napoleon. The one thing I regret most in my life is that I did not make Toussaint. I did not make the black Toussaint governor of Haiti. I blame it on my black wife. Do you know Napoleon was married to a mulatto from the West Indies, which we would call black hair? But do you know, she was the prejudiced one, not Napoleon. Napoleon wanted to make Toussaint governor of Haiti. His wife said, no, why would you give up territory to nigger? It's as crude as that. So bear in mind, here I am responsible. I financed a telephone link-up between Gamal Abdel Mokhtar, the Arab delegate at UNESCO, Sheikh Anthony Diop, the African delegate at UNESCO, myself, the representative of the British Museum, Garland Roberts, who found the pieces, and another gentleman who did translations from the French and British. No, Van Sertima, we can't do that. Because if we start returning this item and that item to this and that museum, we'll have no museum. I said, sir, we're not asking you to return everything from your museums. You're well aware of the things that have been taken from other museums and other places. This is a very specific thing. It is of no value to you. You can't show it. What is the point? You can't show the splinters of the nose. Nobody's interested in splinters. Put the nose back on. But the Arabs do that. Mokhtar, the Arab delegate, never said a bloody word. Boy, he don't want no nigger nose interfering with the tourist trade in Egypt. It's as crude as that. Look why Egypt is no longer Egyptian. These are not the people who built the pyramids. The Syrians attacked in 654 BC. The Persians attacked in 550 BC. The Greeks attacked in 320 BC. The Romans attacked just before and after Christ. The Arabs attacked 638 to 640 AD. That is why Egypt is no longer Egyptian. They have nothing to do with the building of the pyramids. If you go back in the graves, we have found hard evidence in the graves that the Egyptians were African. Let me listen to the anthropologists, all the great anthropologists. Because this is hidden, this doesn't come out in history books. The earliest human fossil found in Egypt was the skeleton of the Nazlet Kata man found near Tata, Egypt, which was dated 35,000 to 30,000 years before Christ. Regarding the racial affinity of this skeleton, Thoma concludes strong alveolar prognatism combined with fossil Prinacilis and an African skull is suggestive of Negroid morphology. He proves it's a Negro. Then comes Wendorf, 1982. Wendorf discovered the skeleton at Wadi Kubaniya, located 10 to 15 kilometers north of Aswan in Egypt. This skeleton dated approximately 20,000 years before Christ. The wide nasal aperture, lower nasal margin morphology, presence of the sulcus prinacilis, wide interorbital distance and alveolar prognatism demonstrate affinities with broad African variants. All of the great anthropologists, archaeologists, Thoma, Fehrenbach, Wendorf, Stewart, Green, Armilagus, Wrightmore, Crawford, all of them prove that those early Egyptians in the Pyramid Age were African. That's the reason why Mokhtar, the Arab delegate, doesn't want a Negro nose on the Sphinx. Because they don't want to relate back. But the Germans sent me, I have it in my new book, you see a beautiful color photograph showing you what the world was 1,200 years before Christ. The black is on top of the world. He is in charge of Egypt. There's no question about it. And they built the pyramids. The Japanese came to my friend Sheikh Anthony Diop, seeking advice on building a pyramid. And Sheikh Anthony Diop said, do not use bronze tools. And the Japanese said, how could you say that? The last stage of the Egyptian was the Bronze Age. And he says the last stage is not the best stage. There you cannot. The Japanese would not listen. They went there. They made such a mess. They had to throw them out. Bronze tools, the tools broke. They had to use air jack hammers in order to cut the stone, and they could not cut it, the stone the ancient blacks in Egypt did. Let me tell you, this is scientists reporting with amazement at how these Africans cut stone. The mean variation of the cutting of the stone from a straight line and from a true square is but 0.01 inch in the length of 75 inches up the face, an amount of accuracy equal to most modern opticians' straight edges of such a length. In other words, we only cut eyeglasses like that. These joints, with an area of some 35 square feet each, were not only worked as finely as this, but were cemented throughout, though the stones were brought as close as 1/500th of an inch, or in fact into contact, and the mean opening of the joint was 1/50th of an inch, yet the builders managed to fill the joint with cement, despite the great area of it, and the weight of the stone to be moved some 16 tons. To merely place such stones in exact contact at the sides would be careful work, but to do so with cement in the joints is almost impossible. This is Flinders Petrie, Our Inheritance of the Great Pyramid, London, 1874. Thus the builders of these great monoliths quarried and cut stone within 1/1000th of an inch of mathematical perfection, and raised the man-made mounting as meticulously as we cut gems. There are approximately 2,300,000 blocks of stone which comprise the Great Pyramid. These individual blocks weigh from 2.5 tons to 70 tons, as much as a railroad locomotive. Originally covered an area of 13.1 acres. The Great Pyramid, listen to this as I close on this part. The Great Pyramid contains more stone than all the churches, chapels, and cathedrals built in England since the time of Christ. If all the stone in this pyramid were sawed into blocks 1 foot in an edge, and these were laid end to end, they would stretch 2/3 of the way around the globe at the equator. The Great Pyramid contains enough stone to construct 30 Empire State Buildings. Now, if you really knew what the African was doing, most of us would not be behaving like inferiors. We'd have challenged the system long time ago. The Africans had a fixation about 7. They had a fixation about 7. They created the 7-day week. There's no such thing, you know. The Africans noticed in Egypt that there are 7 orifices in the human body. I can't mention all of them. There's 7 primary colors in the rainbow: violet, indigo, blue, green, yellow, orange, red. There's 7 notes in the musical scale. There's 7 layers of skin. There's 7 parts of the human brain. There's 7 parts of the human eye. 7 is critical in the ages of man. 7 is the age of reason. 14, 7 years later, puberty. 21, 7 years later, maturation. 7, 7, 7, 7, 7. That is why they created the 7 deadly sins. Christ was in Egypt. He's not an Egyptian, he's a Jew. He was born in Jerusalem, but he went to Egypt. Read Hosea, out of Egypt shall I call my son. He was brought back to Jerusalem, where he was crucified. 7 deadly sins, 7 cardinal virtues, 7 days of the week. That's, the Africans created the 7-day week. There's no such thing. 7, 7, 7, 7, 7. And then they sent out 7 ships across the water. Now they had intimate interconnections with the rest of Africa. We have found evidence of that. Lady Lugard reports a visit of Egyptian pharaohs to Hausaland. We have found, and here is where Diop was very helpful to me. Diop and Obenga. Obenga, 2 weeks ago, introduced me to an audience in California. Obenga is the most remarkable African scholar in the world at the moment. Sheikh Anta Diop was before, but he died. And I managed to make contact with these gentlemen. Sheikh Anta and I had a nice quarrel about tobacco, because Sheikh Anta was the only African who was allowed to examine mummies in a certain part of Egypt, and he found tobacco in this mummy, and I was explaining to him that the Africans have their tobacco, the Americans have their tobacco, and I was pointing out that certain distinctions could be made between the two tobaccos, and that in my book they're using the same term, and I explained why they're using the same term, because of a certain kind of pre-Columbian contact, but that it's not the same tobacco. Well, Diop surrendered, and that he was a most remarkable man. I want to dedicate this lecture to him, because he had the most profound impact on so many of us. We invited him to the Nile Valley Conference, and his plane crashed. He didn't die, and he had to be rushed from the burning plane, and I told him, do not come by plane the next time. You are to go and visit your wife in France, and then you're to do overland, and then you're to take another kind of ship, but do not let it be known where you're moving. Okay, we are not to talk on the telephone. You have to be very careful about that. Diop came to Atlanta. That was a marvelous occasion. He was the most remarkable man I have ever met. And we had these marvelous conversations, etc. But I knew he would die soon, because like John Clark, I noticed it with him too. They do not pay attention to what they're eating. After you get 60, you have to pay close attention to what you're eating. You can't just eat any old thing because it dies there and it's not buried easily. So be very careful. I'm 65 and I know. I exercise every day. Okay, that's what saved my life last year. I was rushed to hospital last year, and these crooks in the hospital, they want to make money because they know Rutgers pays most of the bill, so they want to make money. Not telling they have all sorts of things on my heart. I said, there's nothing wrong with my heart. Yes. They have all these sorts of things on my heart. 3 days in the hospital, and I don't know what's happening. So I got really mad, and when I get mad, I get real mad. I grew up in the bush, and when I get mad, I behave like a bushman. And all the civilized cover, that disappears completely. I just curse, smash up things, etc. And so they came, held me down. I said, I want to leave right now. They said, but you can't leave, you know, you're very ill. Something wrong with your heart. I said, there's nothing wrong with my heart. He said, well, if you leave now, you have to pay the bill. I said, well, I've only been here 3 days. Yes, but your bill is $5,500. I say, well, I'll stay. So they said, I said, but okay, I make a deal with you. Put me on a treadmill if you think there's something wrong with my heart. And I ran a mile at full speed. And then they shook their head. Well, you're under a bit of stress. But if you had run that mile the way you ran it, and there was something wrong with your heart, you would have died. I said, thank you very much for being so truthful at last. But to come back, the incredible things that we're finding now, we found in America, that the Egyptians made a trip to America. They sent out 7 ships. He found it in a tomb in Egypt, where these ships, 7 ships are heading towards the west. 7 was everything to them. So they sent out 7 ships. And we have it in this painting among the Ramesses around 1200 BC, these 7 ships heading towards the west. And we find intimate interconnections between the Egyptians and the rest of the Africans, because people could say, okay, Egypt is separate. Today it is, because the Egyptians are no longer Egyptians, just like the Americans are no longer Americans. You come into this room, it would be hard to find a Native American. You go to Egypt, and it's hard to find an Egyptian. So be very careful about the past and the present. These worlds have changed dramatically. And so we have lots of evidence of their links with the rest of Africa. Sheikh Anta Diop and Theophilo Benga presented, and it's in my new book, more than 100 words in Wolof, a West African language, the language of Sheikh Anta Diop, more than 100 words which are identical in all their forms. That is utterly impossible. UNESCO surrendered. All of these big professors with all their big degrees, and so they had to surrender, because these 2 super Africans proved beyond them, beyond the shadow of a doubt, that that's all a lot of nonsense. This is clearly what we say it is, and they surrendered. It has been established beyond the shadow of a doubt. The connections between Egypt and the rest of Africa were extraordinary. We have Lady Lugar reporting on a visit of Egyptian pharaohs to Hausaland, an Egyptian golden breastplate found in an ancient layer in Nigeria, more than 100 Egyptian words in all their forms and variants found in Wolof, Diop's language. The African word for God, what is the word for God? Amen. You use it in your prayers. That's African. Amen. Jesus was in Egypt, you know. Out of Egypt shall I call my son. He wasn't an Egyptian, he was a Jew, but he went to Egypt. He was smuggled out by his uncle because they were killing off the firstborn. That's how Jesus landed up in Egypt. And the 7-day week is Egyptian. Egyptian golden breastplate found in ancient Nigeria. As I say, nearly 100 Egyptian words in all their forms presented to UNESCO. UNESCO had to surrender. They couldn't believe it. Obenga and Diop proved it beyond a shadow of a doubt. They even take the word for God. What is the word for God in Egypt? Amen. You saying it in your prayers, that's African. Amen. Amun and Amen is Egyptian, and Am is West African, comes from that, and Nyam is East African. So you have Amen and Amun Egyptian, and Am West African, and Nyam East African. Don't think everything is lost. There are all sorts of clues left in the past, and that if you learn certain things, you can pick them up. So they can't fool us anymore. And we find the incredible things that they did, the building of the pyramids and all these things, but they also built remarkable ships. And we have evidence, not only they show their ships moving, but they show, it is shown among the Americans, the Popol Vuh, the Bible, the Quiche Maya. I have the Bible, the Quiche Maya, that shows blacks arrived in America before Christ. Champollion supports that, Lefebvre supports that, Sahagun supports that, Sorensen supports that, Sav Soderbergh supports that, Rosalie supports that. I've been through all these documents. They're finding these things and people are just pushing them aside, but not anymore. Then came the clincher. I was invited to, before the Columbus celebration, I was invited to the Smithsonian, the leading scientific institution in this country, hoping to wipe me out before 1992. And my opponent surrendered. Showed them the 7 braids that you can't argue with. No sculpture in America has 7 braids. 7 is everything to the African Egyptian. He created the 7-day week because he finds there's 7 parts to the human brain, 7 parts to the human eye, 7 notes in the musical scale, 7 primary colors in the rainbow, 7 orifices in the human body, 7 layers of skin. You can't argue with that. So he invented the 7-day week. All this thing about God created the world in 6 days and rested in the 7th, that is taken by the Christians from the Egyptians. Jesus was in Egypt. Even the word Christ, he's not Jesus Christ, he's Jesus the Christ. Christ is an Egyptian word, K-R-S-T, Christ. K-R-S-T, the anointed one. That's how he became the Christ. Don't dismiss him, okay? I'm just pointing out the terms, okay? He was in Egypt, out of Egypt. Read Hosea, out of Egypt shall I call my son. He wasn't born in Egypt, but he was smuggled out in Egypt because Herod was killing the firstborn. And he appears among the Egyptian doctors. And so you get certain evidences like that. And I've checked out this. I have so many sources. Champollion, reporting the 7 ships arriving from across the water. Champollion, Lefebvre, Sahagun, Sorensen, Sav Soderbergh, Rossellini, and above all, the Bible of the Quiche Maya. They destroyed so many books in America, but they didn't destroy all the Bibles of the Quiche Maya. So we have that reporting these dark-skinned people arriving on 7 ships, and they have the 7 ships. And then we have the clincher. We have a map of South America found in ancient Egypt with correct latitudinal and longitudinal coordinates. I showed that to NASA. I was the first person to go to NASA to study blacks in space. You don't even know what it's not only we don't know the history, we don't even know what's happening. Do you know the leading technical astronaut in our space team is a black man? Colonel Gregory. He's restructured the cockpit of our spaceships. Do you know that the leading woman in our space team is a black woman, Dr. Christine Darden? She's reshaping our airplane so that in the 21st century we've just entered certain airplanes, not just the the exotic airplanes would be able to fly faster than sound. Do you know that? No. I had to go there. I nearly died at NASA because they invited me along with delegates from all over the world, China, Russia, various, to witness the blast-off of the first black American in space. And I did not realize I have different ears. I grew up in a forest. I hear lights. I thought everybody heard lights. You have to hear differently in the forest. Because snakes, you can't see snakes. Snakes take on the color of trees and foliage. Therefore, you have to hear that when he starts. You have to hear that, or you're dead. I didn't know I had different ears. I thought everybody heard lights. I'm standing, these Russian and Chinese delegates, and I'm standing, it's 5.5 miles away from the spaceship. This is an awesome thing. It's bigger than a house. And we're going to shoot it off into space. And they start to count down, and they stop. Something wrong. And I start looking nervously, how could something be wrong? You know, a big thing like that with all this incredible thing, if it explodes, what would happen? Then they start to count down again. The third time they start to count down, you had this tremendous noise, and I fell over. Because my ears, blood came out of my ears. Because I hear differently from urban people. I grew up in the jungle. I hear different. So that really startled the hell out of me. I never went back to NASA after that. But I'd learned enough about it. It's in a book, Blacks in Science, Ancient and Modern. You see me with the leading technical astronaut, etc. And you would be amazed what blacks are doing in this country, totally unknown. Bell Labs employs more than 1,000 black scientists. They created the transoceanic cable. They were major in that development. They're reshaping our airplanes. They remade the cockpit of the space shuttle. You never hear about that. If a black commits a crime, yeah, that's news. But when he does something extraordinary, oh my God, no, there's something mistaken here. It's like the New York Times calling the black Val Herbe, so nobody would think it's a black. Now they're saying this Negro they found in Brazil came from Asia. Could you imagine that? She's going to take a ship all the way to the edge of South America and walk all the way up to Brazil because there are no currents will take you out. Walk all the way to Brazil to drop her bloody skull. This is the state of the world we are in. But let me show you the slides now because you have to see some of these things to believe them. So if we could shift to the slides. But there one more thing I must say, just one more thing, very important. They have found a map of South America in ancient Egypt. It was known as the Piri-Reis map because of a Turkish admiral who found it there. And it has correct latitudinal and longitudinal coordinates. No European could have drawn such a map until after 1744 when the chronometer was invented. Yet the Africans had it before Christ.
the term Moor started to become interchangeable with the term black, because it was basically the same thing. But when the slave trade started, they tried to objectify black people, Moorish people. So they would use the term interchangeably, and they would just switch on to calling people black. But if you look at a lot of old documents, there's even slave ships called Blackamoor, if you look at slave records. There was even a boxer out of Virginia who was very popular in the early 1800s named Tom Molyneux, and his nickname was the Moor. So that name was definitely used interchangeably with black or Negro at that time.
Moor means black. Like Negro, Ethiopian. Moor means black. Moor is not a people. Moor is a color. And they have taken this word Moor and they have associated Moor with Muslim. There were Moors that weren't Muslim. Moor means black. There were Christian Moors. There were Moors that practiced a traditional African faith system. So that Moor means black, simple.
When the Moors went into Europe, they changed the appearance of the population. Do you see? So you have Italians, Spaniards being darker than the Scandinavians. A Scandinavian person told me that they never considered the Italians or Jewish people to be white. Do you see? Because the lighter people are further north.
When I went to Europe, I would always look at pictures and I would always see a Moor, and sometimes I would see like a skull and bones. And many of the Moors would have a skull and bones flag. That's what pirates are known for. There were many Moorish pirates. There was even a Barbary War where they were, the U.S. was fighting Moorish pirates up in North Africa and the Barbary Coast. And there's even a secret organization called the Skull and Bones. And we know that Masonry comes from Moorish science. So there's always a connection there with the Moors.
And it's important that as we begin to develop an understanding of this society, that it's not Freemason as we know it, and that the Moors brought in this knowledge into Europe. Africans brought this knowledge into Europe. And in bringing this knowledge into Europe, the Knights Templars and other organizations were born out of this. And peoples of European descent were exposed to alchemy, okay? The periodic table of elements, the laboratory, how to take information, how to take elements and atoms, and to begin to manipulate them to make them into different types of molecules. The basic one is hydrogen, 2 hydrogen is helium, 3 hydrogen is lithium, 6 is carbon, 8 is oxygen. So you have this alchemy that's going to come, and they're going to begin to study, they're going to begin to learn, they're going to create societies that's going to develop an understanding. This is going to be what eventually is going to become Freemasonry, because only a select group of people in Europe is going to be exposed to this information.
Because the secret of Masonry, of who we really are, the Moors, is being here on this land, this particular land. Because it was called, in many names, you had Turtle Island, that we called it, or Tula, or El Marak, the different terms that we had. And the original map of America was written by a guy named Idrisi. The original map was written in Sanskrit.
Antarctica was actually mapped by a Moor. And most people don't know it was mapped by a Moor. And they have old topographical evidence of old maps of Antarctica. That's why the Nazis fled there, because they knew that there were places there under the ice that they could actually inhabit and hide.
This is another one of the numerous figurines that were found in a burial urn with gold and so forth. So it's obviously done out of respect. This is from a place called La Venta, Mexico. It's dated to about 200 AD. This is a beautiful obsidian ware. It was dark, you could see. This is a beautiful black obsidian, which apparently shows a boy bearing, this is not in a servile position, by the way. This is a religious position. This represents the heavens. He's holding up the heaven. There's a Mixtec inscription up here, meaning that this is the sky. So he's not being oppressed or anything. It might look that way, but it isn't. He's holding up the sky. This is dated, well, they haven't got a good date on it because you cannot date obsidian. But they did find some material around it, which may or may relate to its date. This goes back to early Maya time. extreme northern reaches of the Maya civilization. This represents a person of great influence. This is found on the west coast of Mexico. The name escapes me now. The west coast of Mexico. I'm sorry, I forgot the site. He's sitting down. He's squatting down. This is the emblem of kingship. He's bearded. The Mayas did not grow facial hair at all. This is another one. This is a terracotta head from about 2,000 years ago. This is from the Atlantic coast. This is around La Venta also. This is one of the great Olmec heads. And when the archaeologists first saw these, they said, well, they're just typically Indians, you know. And but then they always neglect to say, well, how come the artists who made these always made them out of black basalts? You know, if they're Indians, why are they choosing that to work in? And this is part of this helmet, this marvelous helmet, which nobody could understand. There's no other parallel for this helmet found anywhere in the world except West Africa. Plus you have and then they said, well, they flattened the features so when they carved them, they could move them around without breaking them. And then it was found that they were carved right where they always were. They were never moved. The artists, to give you an idea how these things, how marvelous they are, they weigh over 11 tons apiece, and they were carried 200 miles. This is before the age of machinery, folks. You know, it's all handmade. Whoever got this, they were carried from the Tlaxcala Mountains, which are 200 miles away, 11 tons. They were set up, and then they were carved. So the archaeologists were proved wrong again. Some have suggested the reason why there's just heads is because, well, there's two theories on that, although one of these theories is getting outdated now. One, that these were sacrificed victims. There was a game that the Aztecs called, it was Tlachtli. And in this game, you had to keep this ball in the air all the time. It's a big rubber ball, and the ball represented the sun. And it was played by two different teams. And the team that won, the captain of the team, he had his head cut off. Now, the reason why he did have his head cut off was because he was greatly honored that way in this great victory of getting the ball through the hoop. By having him killed at that moment of victory, it was believed his soul would go straight to heaven. So some people believe that this is a representation of one of those team leaders. It may or may not be, but that doesn't explain the helmet. So they probably are representations more of kings than of sports figures. This is a fanciful representation, but not that fanciful, of what Mu may have looked like from all of the descriptions. It was a very mountainous place. It was very large. More information has come out. There's been a marvelous discovery underwater of something called the Philippine Plate. And it's about the size of Texas. It's under the Pacific, and it was dry land, they figure, about 12,000 years ago, and it's slowly sinking even deeper today in the Central Pacific. It was a mountainous land. Their architecture appears to have been very squarish. This is similar to the Olmec heads. The heads may have been placed up high, not just sitting on the ground. They've been placed on things, these gigantic, colossal representations of human head. They were great seafarers. These are navigable rivers, but they also had a lot of great canals. So this is possibly what this land of Mu looked like. This would be the origin of human civilization. If that's proved, if Mu was the place where civilization began, well then, you know, the contribution of blacks not only to America but to the world is profound, because this is where it all started. Now this is an artist's conception, but now we have some real photographs, or we shall. I guess I should just run through the very fast. The story is that Mu was prosperous, but of course it was on an area known as the Ring of Fire, and that's in the Pacific. The whole Pacific is surrounded by severe volcanic activity. And one day this activity was stimulated horribly when you have this tremendous onrush of water into the Pacific from the glaciers that are melting, and that started a lot of seismic activity. A lot of volcanism took place on the island of Mu, which was a giant island. And here be a representation of their civilization. They did have turrets, by the way. That appears to be the representation of some of their artwork. Caused a lot of tidal activity. A tsunami is a giant tidal wave that's caused by an earthquake. They're actually sea quakes. And the island of Mu may have suffered something like this. The civilization was threatened by the onrush of lava, volcanic activity, and eventually these great waves came and rushed in over the civilization and buried it underwater, smashed it with these great tsunamis. And this is part of the legend now, the fanciful thing of the Great Flood, which appears in worldwide myths, and covered it completely. Now, in 1995, scuba divers off the coast of Okinawa, just sports divers, started to find some very strange-looking features underwater. Some of these photographs are taken from the Japanese press. It hasn't made much publicity in this country. It's been on CNN, but that's about all. Some of these photographs are taken from a video. Others are from the Japanese magazines. And the divers began to find this. This is the first one they found. This is about 100 feet underwater. This is a great plaza. The remains of a stairway, some kind of a walkway. This is off the island of Yonaguni, which is not far from Okinawa. This is part of this great stair. Here's a scuba diver you can see. It's about 100 feet underwater. This is coral incrustation. So they know that it's been underwater a very long time. It's a huge building. It's so big. These buildings are so huge that they're difficult to take in with one shot of the camera, especially because underwater your visibility is limited, of course. Here's another view of another plaza. It's almost like a section of a pie. It's enormously huge. These are 3 divers behind there, so you can kind of see. Now, it's in good shape. These structures are in good shape, which means they probably weren't hit by earthquakes so much as when the water just rose over them. And this looks like the remains of Mu, this triracial or multiracial origin of civilization. It's another shot of divers here. These stairways that are underwater probably were for processions because they're very wide. So we assume that there were dozens and dozens of people in wonderful costumes. And they would climb up these stairs to great plazas where they would hold their rituals. This is to give you some idea again of the size. These are just little divers here. The structure is just enormous. And the people that built this were the people of Mu. And this tradition survives over the course of many centuries. This is a Japanese archaeologist now. And when this thing was first found, they thought, well, maybe it's a natural formation. But then they did measurements, and they found that all the angles are at almost perfect 90-degree angles, and nature doesn't work that way. So it's been confirmed as absolutely man-made. It has these huge ramparts. You can just walk on these things like almost for miles. This all looks very, very ceremonial, very, very spiritual, very religious. Our society, you know, if we were wiped out, you come back, everything would seem very mercantile and materialistic, and not much would survive. But here, the emphasis seems to be on the spiritual aspects a lot. A lot of processional ways for showing off clothing and rituals with the gods, ceremonies for the gods. This is another strange flight of steps that terminates like this. Mostly these are stairways. This is a diver again going away. An enormous block. Now this one is the best I could get of this, but this is one of the early pieces that was found last summer. Excuse me, a year ago last summer. It's an enormous arch. It's a gate, and you can see here all the stones are fitted very beautifully. Some of this masonry does not appear at all in Japan. The Japanese never built anything like this. But it does appear in 2 places. It appears in Peru, amongst the Incas, and also amongst some stonework found in North Africa, a place called Lixus. So, again, there's some interesting parallels here. This is an enormous archway, and here you can see this is a diver on the other side swimming through it. Again, it's too big to fit in the picture. This is, again, the same plaza. Hopefully we'll get some better shots when we get over there. We're planning our own photo expedition over there. This is the remains of a canal or a channel of some kind. And these little steps here are not to walk on, but to facilitate the speed with which the water goes down. So this was all cut on dry land one time. This is for irrigation of some kind. Again, these enormous blocks. Here's the diver here again for size. This is almost like an enormous throne here with an armrest. This is a drawing, of course, from Japanese television. This is one of the structures which is so huge it can't be photographed, at least not yet anyway. You have these enormous blocks of stone, this roadway that goes for like about a quarter of a mile across the bottom of the ocean, and then these steps that go all the way to the top. We presume that when this was dry land, before the water went over the top, there were gods, idols, a temple, something like that. And again, this is dated to about 10,000 years ago. This is another... The Japanese went to a lot of trouble to make this enormous model. This model is like about 30 feet long. And this shows one section of it, what it looks like. There's a flight of stairs that goes up, and then there's a long processional way, and there are these two pylons on either side. It's a ceremonial building, a public building of some kind. At the top are these two... It appears that it has been seen. So, the dates for that are pretty reliable. This is an overhead view of one of the structures, again, basically what it would look like. This is a drawing. This is one of the models that the Japanese have done. I'll give you a general idea what it looks like. Apparently, this was natural rock, which the ancients terraformed, or molded into their own way, and then they built platforms. This is just a model of a boat, again, for size. And that's all. I just wanted to be able to share that with you. If you have any questions on this, I'd be more than happy to try to answer them. And yes, sir.
Question about the gentleman holding his arms out. What was that standing up?
Oh, let me just run that back then real fast for you. I think that's probably a model of a boat. Oh, that? Yeah, this is a model of a boat, just to give an idea for size. This yacht's about 40 feet long in real life, and this is to show you how big the structure is overall. It appears that there were like houses or some kind of temple foundations on top. They've all been washed away, of course. They were wood, and all that remains is the stone. But
who do the Japanese say these people were?
The Japanese say just exactly what I told you. They believe the same thing. They have traditions of Mu that go back centuries or thousands of years. But the real research on the triracial aspect of it came out about 1876 by a guy by the name of James Churchward. He was a colonel in the British Army. And he spent his whole life researching this before it was found. And he gathered up all the traditions of the Japanese, the Polynesians, and so on. And the theme that came back over and over again was this triracial idea of these. And sometimes, like the Polynesians, didn't even know about whites or blacks because they were so isolated, some of them in their islands. But they said that's part of our tradition, that there was this black people who shared power with the brown people who they were descended from. So this is now being accepted by the Japanese because Churchward is like big authority on Mu. Well, the origin of human life in Africa goes back long before this even. This is the origin of civilization, not of man or of life. That took a long time for human beings to rise up from their earlier beginnings to become civilized. This appears to be where man reached civilization. It took a long time. It took maybe, well, hundreds of thousands of years at least. Yes. It's really strange to see these giant steps. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, I don't know about the extraterrestrials, but it's interesting you mention about the giants, because the Polynesians have said about how giants did build these places. And there's all kinds of stories. So I don't know that they were actually giants, but they might have been very, very tall people. That's right. Yeah. These structures are all oriented east and west. That means that they oriented with the rising and setting of the sun. Right. Absolutely. Yeah, you've done good research. Yeah. Well, if you have no further questions, I really thank you for coming and letting me share this with you. I think this is interesting and important stuff, and we're going to be featuring more of it in our magazine. Yes?
I have a question concerning these tablets and these letters. What do the letters look like?
The letters, they look like part Egyptian, they look part Phoenician, but they're not. They look kind of Phoenician, they look kind of Egyptian. Now, some of the letters are Egyptian, and you can translate words, but you can't translate a whole sentence. So it's like a mix of something. But they haven't figured out what that language is on those plates yet. It looks Egypto-Phoenician. The plates are all being held by Mr. Russell Burroughs. He is the discoverer of the cave. And he has them all warehoused, and well, he sold some. He sold some to professional investigators who've done tests on them. And it was important for him to do that because these investigators have proved that they're authentic. If he had just kept them, you know, people say, well, maybe you made them, you know. So they've been thoroughly tested and found they are real. They're real in the sense that they are ancient, that they were made 2,000 or more years ago. And so all this is going to be coming out soon. It's coming out in our magazine, the next issue. We're not going to be the only ones that are covering it. It's going to be, there's a television special made now, going to be out early next year. It's called The Mystery Cave of Many Faces. At least that's the name they're using for it now. The cave is located in southern Illinois. Pardon me? He has not disclosed exactly where because he's afraid that people will go in there and destroy it. But he just told us it's around Olney, Illinois, if you know where that is. Olney, it's like, okay, I'll give you an idea. It's like 120 miles southeast of St. Louis. Yes, sir. Yeah.
Why is it that they haven't done this with this?
Well, I think that there's all kinds of political reasons involved. People have their own personal agendas, and I don't want to really talk on that because I don't know why they would not want to share this. The only thing I know is that there's a new generation of people coming up now who are open to the possibility of people from Africa, especially from Mali, who came here and did great things. So it's coming out.
I'm suspicious that the government has in the seat with this particular thing.
I don't know. The government is very hard to second guess, you know. So our opposition, or the only opposition we found to this, it really comes not from the government, but from old-style archaeologists. The reason why is because an archaeologist can't make much money by themselves. Archaeology doesn't pay. The only way you can make money being an archaeologist is to write a book, and you go to class, you have a class you teach, and you make all the students buy your book, see? And your ideas are in that book. And if somebody comes along and says, oh, no, there was somebody here before Columbus, then he's going to object to that because he doesn't have that in his book. See, so there we're getting resistance from these old-style archaeologists. But they can't stop it now because it's too well documented. Yes, sir.
Does this shake some of the now standing secret societies as far as what they've been teaching their memberships? It would kind of like shake their foundations to the point of what?
Well, I think some of these secret societies, I mentioned like the Masons, for example, the Masons have known about some of this for a long time, but they keep it all to themselves as part of their lodges. And so now some of the stuff is going to be public knowledge, so it'll be interesting to see how they react.
It wouldn't be any, in other words, the money that people spent would be sort of like for what?
Well, I don't know. I can't say that. Yeah, I don't think I can answer that authoritatively. I'm just a reporter. I'm not a political scientist or an archaeologist. And my job is just to get this stuff out. Well, I got to be honest about it. Okay. I didn't think it was that much, but I know that there have been traces of blacks found in China. And that also is suppressed or just not publicized at all. But I never heard of a number quite that huge. And that the Chinese knew about it like for many, many years. You know, but that's part of the migration from Mu through the Pacific, it appears. Yes? No, not in the islands of Japan so much. But it's an interesting point that the Japanese people represent, you know, a homogeneous race. But the people on Okinawa, they're racially different. They're racially very, very different. And they don't even speak the same language. The people on Okinawa don't even consider themselves Japanese. So it looks like there's some other influences at work there over a very long period of time. Something. Yes, ma'am. It looks that way. Yes. 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 Right. See, there have been legends about this civilization before Egypt, but no proof. But now, with the DNA testing, with these structures found off of Japan, there's a lot of indication that what we're looking at is, in fact, Mu. And also, just to study the legends of the Polynesians, where they talk about it. I mean, you don't have a myth that survives for hundreds or thousands of years without having a kernel of truth behind it. And all these are just different pieces of a puzzle which are coming together. So yeah, Mu looks like the first civilization. It does. Atlantis? That's a whole other subject. I can't even begin to get into that now. maybe another lecture. I'm sorry. But I'm kind of focused on this. Well, I think a valid point you bring up, we are taught in school that the earliest civilizations are Egyptian and Mesopotamian, that nobody came over to America except Columbus. I think these are all outdated ideas. We're going to find that there were many people here before Columbus and that there were several civilizations before Egypt, that those people got their ideas from places like Mu. Maybe Mu isn't the oldest. Maybe there was some even before that. I don't know. But we do know this is before Egypt. I would not rule out Atlantis or even other places we don't even know about yet. I like metaphysics a lot. I'm interested in it, but I try to keep it separate from this. Yeah. The fifth. Yeah. Right, right. That's Madame Blavatsky and the Theosophists. Oh. Well, you're ahead of me there, I think. Yes, yes. Right, very interesting. That's the end of... something big will happen then.
When you showed that other clip that I asked you to show back, it seemed as though, my eyes play no tricks on me, that it was being held in the air by itself, that model ship that was standing.
Oh, he just had a thin wire that held it up, that's all. Yeah, sure. They didn't want to show that.
That's what I want to know. You sure they had the wire?
Yeah, you can see it clearer on the video. I just took this off the video there. Yeah, he wasn't levitating his ship or anything.
All right, yeah.
So, okay. Well, any other questions? Well, again, thank you very much for allowing me to share this with you. And the Ouachita also is going to be carrying some of this in their newspaper. So. Right. Right, that's when it first came out. And now all this new material, we can hardly keep up with it, so much new stuff.
Why does this loom to be such an explosive political year? Because this is the year of politics. This is the year when all of the white politicians are going to come into the Negro community. You never see them until election time. You can't find them until election time. They're going to come in with false promises. And as they make these false promises, they're going to feed our frustrations. And this will only serve to make matters worse. I'm no politician. I'm not even a student of politics. I'm not a Republican, nor a Democrat, nor an American, and got sense enough to know it. I'm one of the 22 million black victims of the Democrats. One of the 22 million black victims of the Republicans, and one of the 22 million black victims of Americanism. And when I speak, I don't speak as a Democrat or a Republican. I speak as a victim of America's so-called democracy. You and I have never seen democracy. All we've seen is hypocrisy. When we open our eyes today and look around America, we see America not through the eyes of someone who has enjoyed the fruits of Americanism. We see America through the eyes of someone who has been the victim of Americanism. We don't see any American dream. We've experienced only the American nightmare. We haven't benefited from America's democracy. We've only suffered from America's hypocrisy. And the generation that's coming up now can see it and are not afraid to say it. If you go to jail, so what? If you're black, you were born in jail. If you black, you were born in jail. In the North as well as the South. Stop talking about the South. As long as you're south of the Canadian border, you're South. Don't call Governor Wallace a Dixie governor. Romney is a Dixie governor. 22 million black victims of Americanism are waking up, and they're gaining a new political consciousness, becoming politically mature. And as they develop this political maturity, they're able to see the recent trends in these political elections. They see that the whites are so evenly divided that every time they vote, the race is so close they have to go back and count the votes all over again. And which means that any block, any minority that has a block of votes that stick together is in a strategic position. Either way you go, that's who gets it. You're in a position to determine who go to the White House and who stay in the doghouse. You're the one who has that power. You can keep Johnson in Washington, D.C., or you can send him back to his Texas cotton patch. You're the one who sent Kennedy to Washington. You're the one who put the present Democratic administration in Washington, D.C. The whites were evenly divided. It was the fact that you threw 80% of your votes behind the Democrats that put the Democrats in the White House. When you see this, you can see that the Negro vote is the key factor. And despite the fact that you are in a position to be the determining factor, what do you get out of it? The Democrats have been in Washington, D.C. only because of the Negro vote. They've been down there 4 years. And all other legislation they wanted to bring up, they've brought it up and gotten it out of the way, and now they bring up you. And now they bring up you. You put them first and they put you last. Because you're a chump. A political chump. In Washington, D.C., in the House of Representatives, there are 257 who are Democrats. Only 177 are Republicans. In the Senate, there are 67 Democrats. Only 33 are Republicans. The party that you bash controls 2/3 of the House of Representatives and the Senate, and still they can't keep their promise to you, because you're a chump. Anytime you throw your weight behind a political party that controls 2/3 of the government, and that party can't keep the promise that it made to you during election time, and you're dumb enough to walk around continuing to identify yourself with that party, you're not only a chump, but you're a traitor to your race. And what kind of alibi do they come up with? They try and pass the buck to the Dixiecrats. Now, back during the days when you were blind, deaf, and dumb, ignorant, politically immature, naturally you went along with that. But today, as your eyes come open and you develop political maturity, you're able to see and think for yourself. And you can see that a Dixiecrat is nothing but a Democrat in disguise. You look at the structure of the government that controls this country. It's controlled by 16 senatorial committees and 20 congressional committees. Of the 16 senatorial committees that run the government, 10 of them are in the hands of Southern segregationists. Of the 20 congressional committees that run the government, 12 of them are in the hands of Southern segregationists. And they're going to tell you and me that the South lost the war.